Jordan Peterson is a man who needs no introduction in 2022. The clinical psychologist turned public political and cultural commentator has a backstory that is quite familiar, so there's really no need to go into it that much. As for his current activities, he has aligned with Daily Wire, a conservative news organization spearheaded by Ben Shapiro, to make more explicitly politics-focused content in an effort to combat what he sees as a cultural war against the left in the Western world. He characterizes his enemies as employers of postmodern thought or adherents to a type of postmodernism. While postmodernism has had a variety of definitions across disciplines, such as architecture and literature, it seems to be relatively clear that Jordan Peterson has gained his understanding of postmodern thought from a specific text, Explaining Postmodernism, Skepticism and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault by Stephen Hicks. The book's most general argument is that there is a certain tradition in Western thought, specifically in philosophy, that began as a reaction to the Enlightenment that has led to what we would consider today to be postmodernism, that took its most distinctive form in academia after the failure of socialist projects across the world. This book has been criticized pretty forcefully before by CCK Philosophy, where he points to numerous misreadings and scholarship errors, and I will leave a link to this video in the description below. Many people are already aware of this criticism, but many are less aware that Stephen Hicks actually responded to some of the criticisms made by CCK in episode number 40 of his Open College podcast. One of the criticisms he addresses is CCK's argument that Hicks was forced to go through less than adequate publication practices in order to get Explaining Postmodernism published, and assuming Hicks is telling the truth in this podcast episode, which I think we can, I think Hicks successfully defends himself and his book in that respect. But as for the criticisms of the content, Hicks offers very poor responses to CCK, especially in his treatment of German philosopher Immanuel Kant, characterizing him as anti-reason, anti-objectivity, and anti-enlightenment. In this video, I would like to address the shortcomings of Hicks' account of Kant's philosophy in Explaining Postmodernism, and I would also like to dive deeper into precisely why Hicks' defense of his unorthodox reading of Kant and his response to CCK is inadequate. What I am not doing in this video is attempting to refute the whole cohesive argument offered by the entirety of Explaining Postmodernism about postmodernism's relation to the contemporary left. I am simply critiquing a specific philosophical account in hopes that this will inform a proper assessment of the validity of Hicks' broader argument, something I would encourage you to decide for yourself. For example, maybe Hicks is right about Kant and postmodernism. Maybe Kant has nothing to do with postmodernism. Or maybe he does fit into a philosophical lineage that leads to postmodernism, just not in the way that Hicks portrays him. Just to note, all of my sources will be in the description. Oh, also, if Dr. Hicks ends up seeing this for some reason, I just want to make it explicit that I am not a postmodernist and I'm also not a Kantian either. Hicks' elaboration of Kant's philosophy begins in Chapter 2 of Explaining Postmodernism by characterizing him as the most significant thinker of the counter-enlightenment, whose attack on Enlightenment reason, more than anyone else's, opened the door to the 19th century irrationalists and idealist metaphysicians, and began the epistemological route to postmodernism. If you remember anything you have ever been taught about Kant, you can already tell that this is a controversial reading of his philosophy, as he is almost always thought of as paradigmatic of the Enlightenment, and so it seems we should prepare ourselves for a different reading than the traditional one, and it is fair that we give it our full attention. In order to position Kant as counter-Enlightenment, Hicks sets up an opposition between pro- and anti-reason camps, in which pro-reason philosophers hold that reason is capable of knowing reality, while anti-reason philosophers hold that reason is incapable of doing this. Specifically, Hicks characterizes the pro-reason stance as holding that our rational faculty is a cognitive function, taking its material from reality, understanding the significance of that material, and using that understanding to guide our actions in reality. In order to respond, it is important that we understand that, for Hicks, what makes a philosopher pro-reason is holding the position that reason is capable of knowing reality. We'll come back to this later. In terms of this constructed conflict, Hicks thinks Kant is crystal clear about where he stands, since, according to Kant, noumenal reality is forever closed off to the faculty of reason. It is limited to awareness and understanding of its own subjective products. It is helpful to begin with Kant's problem with pure reason, that is, reason divorced from empirical observation. For Kant, most synthetic knowledge, or knowledge that requires one to know more than just the terms involved in a proposition, is gained by empirical observation. For example, we can learn that the proposition "some alligators are white" is true by observing a range of different alligators out in nature and finding that a rare bunch are white. He also recognizes that much of our analytic knowledge, or knowledge that is knowable strictly in terms of logical principles and definitions, comes a priori, or independent of empirical experience. The classic example is about the term bachelor. If you know the definition of the word bachelor, you know that a bachelor is unmarried. You do not have to find one out in the real world and ask them. But Kant also recognizes that we can get certain kinds of synthetic knowledge a priori. For example, in doing a simple math problem such as 3 plus 4, we find that the answer 7 is developed synthetically outside of the definition of 3 plus 4, and we don't have to count 7 of a specific object in the real world to find that 3 plus 4 does in fact equal 7, thus synthetic a priori knowledge. Kant thinks that when philosophers of his time were examining metaphysical issues, they were dealing with questions of the level of interest and depth that synthetic knowledge covers, such as the nature of the soul and God, while also conducting their reasoning completely separate from empirical experience. He saw that synthetic a priori knowledge was possible, for example in mathematics, and thought that metaphysics ought to be the same way, and in order to inquire into the more precise nature of our reason, he asked, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? As we can see, Kant focused the aim of his project on ensuring that our metaphysical reasoning could give us the substance and force of synthetic knowledge, while still retaining the necessity and universality, or objectivity, of the a priori. In other words, Kant truly wanted to ensure that our metaphysical reasoning, in fact, did have close contact with the phenomenal reality of human cognition. This demonstration alone seems to clear Kant from Hicks's suspicion of anti-reason, but we can go further to address more specificities of Hicks's argument. Later in the chapter, Hicks states that the idea that our sense organs are obstacles to direct consciousness of reality was critical for Kant's analysis. Despite this being critical for Kant's philosophy, Hicks fails to give a citation for this claim, likely because this is a misrepresentation of Kant's system from Hicks. First, it is important to note that it is indeed true that Kant holds that the human subject does not have access to noumenal reality, or the realm of things in themselves. Kant elaborates that the noumena are what ground the perceptible phenomena that we encounter in the natural world, but the forms of intuition and categories of understanding retain an inability to comprehend the noumena. While this appears to be a vague, imprecise formulation of what the noumena actually are, Kant will go on to say that a noumenon is an object of a non-sensible intuition. Since the human subject cognizes external sensible objects in space and time, we do not possess the faculty, which Kant says involves the intellectual intuition, to access the things in themselves. Thus, Hicks is correct in saying that, according to Kant, humans do not have access to the most fundamentally real noumenal world. For Kant, even though the human subject and their sense organs contribute to the way in which they make sense of their experience, namely the two forms of intuition and the pure concepts of understanding, these things are actually what make contact with reality possible. These features of the human mind are precisely what structure objectivity, as they themselves are objective features of the human mind's contact with reality. For example, Kant sees that we represent to ourselves objects outside us and all, as in space. That is, when we perceive objects outside of ourselves, we necessarily perceive them in a spatial orientation. This fact does not automatically mean that humans cannot interact with reality because space inhibits us from truly perceiving what is real. Rather, space is a necessary representation, a priori, which is the ground of all outer intuitions. One can never represent that there is no space, although one can very well think that there are no objects to be encountered in it. It is therefore to be regarded as the condition of the possibility of appearances, not as a determination dependent on them, and is an a priori representation that necessarily grounds outer appearances. Although space can be said to be a subjective creation of the human mind, this in no way means that it is subjective in confronting cognizable reality, as it is a necessary and universal feature of all human minds. According to Kant, I cannot simply stop representing outer objects in space on virtue of my own subjectivity. I cannot subjectively decide to not understand the spatial relations between my desk, my laptop, and my water bottle. The intuition of space is what allows me to objectively ground these objects in the first place. Only if I did not have the form of space or any other essential feature of human cognition for Kant's philosophy, then reality would be completely unintelligible. For Kant, only if I did not have the cognitive structures of my sense organs, then I would not be able to know reality. If this is not enough, Kant, in the fourth paralogism, writes that external objects, bodies, are merely appearances, hence also nothing other than a species of my representations, but are nothing separated from them. The consequence of this is that external objects, or objects in external phenomenal reality, do really exist and are knowable by human minds. Kant's transcendental idealism is precisely what grounds his view as an empirical realist. Because external phenomenal reality is what is cognizable by human rational agents, we can coherently speak objectively about phenomena. Hicks even seems to understand this on pages 35 and 36 of his book, when he recognizes that, on Kant's view, the phenomenal world of experience now has necessary and universal features built into it, but posits a defect in the view as any necessary and universal features that science discovers in the phenomenal world will have application only in the phenomenal world. Science requires that the objects to be scientifically studied are observable in the natural world, but most do not consider this an internal defect of science, at least when science is being applied to observable phenomena. Again, we remember that the phenomenal world conceived in this way by the human mind is precisely what allows us objectivity, what allows us to avoid the gap of unintelligibility and avoid the break between reality and our knowledge of it. To hammer this point home, Kant shows that the alternative to his view, transcendental realism, or the view that regards space and time as something given in themselves, independent of our sensibility, actually holds that, since outer objects would exist apart from sense, the human subject cannot know if the reality of outer objects is certain, demonstrating that the alternative to Kant's view results in a divorce between reason and reality. It is not for the transcendental idealist, but rather for the transcendental realist that the sense organs become an obstacle to reality. Kant writes that every outer perception, therefore, immediately proves something real in space, or rather is itself the real. To that extent, empirical realism is beyond doubt, i.e., to our outer intuitions, there corresponds something real in space. Of course, space itself, with all its appearances as representations, is only in me, but in this space, the real, or the material of all objects of outer intuition, is nevertheless really given, independently of all invention. It would seem, then, that Kant falls under Hicks' pro-reason camp by his own definition. Kant clearly does think reason allows us to interact with cognizable reality, possible objects of experience, by using the necessary and universal forms of intuition and the pure concepts of the understanding. Saying that these features are simply subjective is true in the broadest sense, but misleading, as Kant thinks that humans can develop objective knowledge about the world using them, as, although they are contributed by the human subject, they are precisely the conditions that allow us to speak objectively about things, as shown by his confidence in our reasoning to lead us to objective knowledge. For the second part of the video, I would like to discuss Hicks's defense of his reading of Kant in Explaining Postmodernism he made in episode number 40 of his Open College podcast. It takes place from about the 2-minute mark to the 11-minute mark. I find this defense largely unconvincing for multiple reasons. He does not make it clear that his reading of Kant is controversial. It is unclear where his reading of Kant fits into the readings of Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche, three philosophers that he approximates his Kant reading to. And I find that Hicks really attempts to effectively shimmy out of having a strong interpretation of Kant by undervaluing its importance to the broader argument of his book. At around the 3-minute mark of the podcast, Hicks says, "I do go out of my way to say that this is a controversial interpretation of Kant." This is nowhere to be found, at least in the Kant chapter, where you would think someone who claims that they went out of their way to make something clear about Kant would put this very thing. This may seem to contradict my earlier statement about Hicks's controversy, but the problem lies in the fact that I had to have already learned about Kant in order to recognize Hicks's interpretation as controversial. For those with little or no exposure to philosophy, it is not clear at all from the text that this is an unpopular polemical account of the philosopher. Now, it's important to note that it very well may be somewhere else in the book and I just happened to miss it. I also know that there are multiple editions of the book, so it's possible that I have an edition that does not include this. However, I am reading the PDF that is available on Stephen Hicks' website, and I would think that at the very least that going out of your way to make something clear would include some sort of stipulation that the version available for download does not have certain things that other versions have. Later in the video, Hicks says that he was surprised to see CCK's astonishment at his own arguments as, looking at the history of philosophy, Hicks's interpretation would fit into the readings of Kant done by Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. The only thing he cites to support this claim is a section from Nietzsche's 1874 work, Schopenhauer as Educator, which says that a gnawing and crumbling skepticism and relativism would accompany any popularity of Kant's thought, and goes on to briefly discuss German poet Heinrich von Kleist's skeptical encounter with Kant's philosophy. Nothing for Schopenhauer or Kierkegaard. Schopenhauer is certainly an interesting philosopher to compare oneself to when criticizing Kant, as he essentially saw himself as the true heir to the Kantian philosophical system. My line of reasoning has clearly been very influenced by Kantian ideas. It necessarily presupposes them and takes them as its point of departure. That being said, he was certainly out to correct errors he saw in his philosophy, so it is not at all far-fetched to compare a criticism of Kant to Schopenhauer's. What is even more interesting is that Schopenhauer believes that Kant's greatest merit is to distinguish between appearance and thing in itself, by proving that the intellect always stands between us and things, which is why we cannot have cognition of things as they may be in themselves. On its face, this selection sounds a lot like Hicks' assertion that Kant's critical point was that our sense organs are obstacles to direct consciousness of reality. However, it seems that Hicks has absorbed the language of Schopenhauer, but not the philosophical content of his argument. Almost immediately after, when giving a summary of Kant's transcendental philosophy, he sees Kant's conclusion as the notion that the objective world does not belong to the essence of things in themselves, but rather only to its appearance. That is, the phenomenal world of appearance that we experience is the world that we reason according to and can speak objectively about. I really don't need to reiterate the understanding of Kant that I have presented before that this directly coincides with. Because of this, it is entirely unclear what part of Schopenhauer's criticism Hicks agrees with, as the later developments of the criticism have less to do with Kant's view of reason's contact with reality, and more about Schopenhauer's particular development on the thing in itself, the transcendental deduction, and other secondary matters which are a subject for another video. Thus, it is hard to locate Hicks in relation to Schopenhauer. Kierkegaard's writing on Kant is much more scarce than Schopenhauer, and much of it is more related to ethics and philosophy of religion, rather than metaphysics or epistemology, which are exactly what is relevant for what we are discussing here. Further, much of Kierkegaard's engagement with the metaphysics and epistemology had to do with Kant's critique of the traditional proofs for God's existence, necessity, and the concept of God. Again, not entirely relevant. While it certainly may be argued that Kierkegaard owes a particular debt to Kantian philosophy, that doesn't make it easy to identify. In an effort to not accuse Hicks of a particular misunderstanding of Kierkegaard that would lead him to connect his own Kant reading with Kierkegaard's, I think it suffices for now to say that the relationship between Hicks and Kierkegaard is entirely unclear. Nietzsche, on the other hand, engaged explicitly and frequently with Kant's philosophy over the duration of his entire career as a writer. That being said, Nietzsche is known to have developed his ideas about different areas of philosophy over time across his entire corpus. As such, it is difficult to elaborate the nuance of Nietzsche's critique of metaphysics in a few short statements, but I'll do my best anyway. I feel that the most relevant discussion of the issues at stake here is found in a later note of Nietzsche's that was included in a larger collection of notes organized after he went insane, The Will to Power. Because it is a later piece of writing, it seems reasonable to assume that the position he takes in it was more or less the most definitive, developed response to Kant in this subject matter. In it, Nietzsche begins by ascribing to Kant theological prejudice and unconscious dogmatism. This would indeed line up with the characterization that Hicks has of Kant decisively choosing religion over reason. Nietzsche believes similarly that Kant's philosophical system was a sly backtrack to a religious faith. However, it did not at all follow from this that Nietzsche also believed that Kant showed any meaningful skepticism towards reason whatsoever, in fact, quite the opposite. Later in the passage, Nietzsche will remark that Kant believes in the fact of knowledge. That is, Nietzsche thought that Kant naively presupposed that legitimate knowledge could arise from the metaphysical conclusions of the transcendental system. He thought that what Kant considered a priori knowledge was merely regulative articles of belief that did nothing other than exist as weak bolsters to Kant's entire philosophy. According to Nietzsche, it is precisely Kant's view of these articles as genuine true knowledge that prevents him from seeing their epistemological shortcomings. In other words, Kant's confidence in reason leading to knowledge is his error. This seems to be far from Hicks' anti-reason Kant account, and thus it remains unclear if the connection between Hicks and Nietzsche does exist. As a final note on this point, it's extremely important to recognize that the arguments I have furthered about the philosophers in this section of the video are really just scratching the surface of the scholarship. Discovering what a philosopher intended their work to mean and how sequential philosophers responded to it is a project for an entire career. That being said, I want my arguments to show that at the very least, it is not simple enough to handle this type of thing with a few short remarks, and it may be fair to say that not even I have said enough here to definitively show the disconnect between Hicks's Kant interpretation and that of Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. My final and I think most important critique of Hicks's defense of his Kant reading is that he attempts to shimmy around the need for adequate accuracy and coherency of the book's Kant chapter, because, in a way, it doesn't matter what Hicks's interpretation of Kant is, because of the more important issue Hicks is tackling in the book, that being Kant's relationship to postmodernism. There are multiple problems with this assertion. First off, it is in fact the case that Hicks, in even writing the chapter on Kant, is positing a certain interpretation of Kant, that is, the one that's in his book, and if we care at all about correctness in reading a philosopher, it is obvious that this is a matter of importance. If we want our philosophy scholarship to have any worth at all, in no way does it not matter what Hicks's interpretation of Kant is, regardless of whether or not it falls second or last in a list of his arguments sorted by relevance or importance. Second, Hicks's broader argument about postmodernism rests on the interpretation of Kant that he posits. It is utterly dependent on it. Over the course of the book, he essentially argues Kant's philosophy sowed the seeds for the ideas that would eventually sprout in postmodern philosophy. But if Hicks has an impoverished account of what Kant's philosophy actually is, it seems we would have clear reason to doubt his complex overarching argument in the first place. Otherwise, it would have simply sufficed to say that postmodern philosophers were influenced by Kant, instead of devoting a whole chapter characterizing Kant as anti-reason and anti-objectivity. There is a big difference between saying a specific postmodern philosopher had elements of their philosophy influenced by Kant, and drawing the close alignment that Hicks does between Kant and postmodernism. Pretty much all of Western philosophy is derived from Plato and Aristotle, so why not put the historical intellectual turning point for postmodernism here? After all, it is when Western philosophy as we understood it really began to take hold in writing and thought. No one would ever deny Plato, Aristotle, and Kant's importance in the history of philosophy, but assigning the anti-objectivity and anti-reason labels that Hicks definitively sees in postmodernism, regardless of whether or not these are correct, to an older thinker seems at least a little bit weak. This video became way longer than I originally anticipated, so I'm just going to conclude by plugging my and Telos-bound social media and give a special shout out to Gordon Horowitz for making the amazing Bramble background. Thanks for watching.